Hello again. I wanted to talk this morning about a refugee crisis which saw 250,000 people enter Britain over the space of just a few months, peaking at 16,000 people a day. They arrived in this country by sea from the coast of Belgium and France. The country had never seen anything like it. The reason I want to draw attention to this refugee crisis is to illustrate how the word refugee has changed in meaning. It once meant people given temporary shelter until they were able to set themselves on their feet again. Today, though, the word refugee is synonymous with immigrant. In other words, once we allow a refugee into the country, then the chances are he will soon have his feet under the table and be with us forever. This is not at all what most people in this country want. People sometimes reproach me for the views which I express about refugees and asylum seekers on this channel, pointing out that Britain has in the past had a fine reputation for offering shelter to the dispossessed and persecuted. Why should we not continue to show this compassion today? Such views often stem from an ignorance about the past, for which reason I thought that it might be interesting to look at the greatest refugee crisis which Britain ever faced, and then consider the long-term effects, if any, of that crisis, and how it compared to the modern refugee crisis. On August the 4th, 1914, Britain went to the aid of Belgium. Germany had invaded the neutral country of Belgium, and Britain had promised to go to their aid if necessary. So they declared war on Germany. The Germans behaved with great brutality in Belgium, shooting many civilians and sparking a refugee crisis. I've been reminding myself of the details from a couple of standard works on the period. A.J.P. Taylor, of course, and Martin Gilbert's Atlas of the First World War. Now that Gilbert's work is a little more recent. I say more recent, but it was published in 1970. I was surprised to find when looking through it that A.J.P. Taylor's classic work will be 60 years old next year. How time flies. In the description to this video I give a link to a more up-to-date source from the Imperial War Museum's website. All these confirm what I remembered, that in the closing months of 1914 250,000 Belgian refugees arrived in England, most of them civilians, but including some wounded soldiers and some soldiers who hoped to return to fight the Germans. Curiously, these people left from exactly the same parts of the coast from where the modern flood of refugees originates. Imagine, though, not a few hundred refugees from that area each day, as we've seen in the last year or two, but 16,000 a day. What a crisis! The greatest refugee crisis we've ever seen. People offered homes to the refugees in England, and eventually an entire village was built for them in the north of England. They worked enthusiastically in armaments factories and were very law-abiding and grateful for the shelter which this country provided. They knew, though, that England was a temporary refuge, nothing more. In 1918, when the war came to an end and Belgium was liberated, those refugees couldn't wait to return to their own country. They all went home, bar a handful who had married English women. Today, nobody even remembers this refugee crisis, because of course these people were not immigrants, but genuine refugees who only wanted short-term help. They behaved very well once in England and worked hard to be of use to the country. They didn't outstay their welcome, and as soon as possible they returned to their own country. The thumbnail to this video shows the memorial which Belgium paid for in London to show their gratitude for the hospitality which they received here. This may be found on the Embankment in London. It's just opposite Cleopatra's Needle for those that wish to visit. This then is a case of genuine refugees, not immigrants disguising themselves as refugees. They did not seek to change the country which gave them shelter, nor did they abuse the hospitality they received. Perhaps that is why we no longer remember those refugees. I will leave it to viewers to compare the refugee crisis from the French and Belgian coast in 1914 and the one which we now see from the same area. And I wonder how many differences they can spot between the two crises.